I see a raised hand.
That's Pete.
Pete, if you want to talk, I see your raised hand. Go ahead and talk.
He's done you.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. I'm still here. If you need me, just call upon me at any time. You're doing a great job, and I want to thank you for taking over the helm of this ship, and very, very pleased with the job you're doing. Very good.
Well, thank you, Pete. I read everything that you sent, and I tried to maintain the the emphasis on the same type of things.
You're doing very, very well. The important thing is for people to understand that this is not a blood and guts kind of system. It's a learning experience, and they should take their time. And if they can share their findings with the owner, fine. Especially if it's something that's, I would have to say, is a little bit obscure. Many of these owners want the car to be as perfect as they can make it. So you're doing them a favor by pointing out some of these things.
Good. And, one of the things I wanted to mention, it looks like everybody should be back by now. One of the things I wanted to mention is that I've actually seen judges, and in fact, I've seen in judging schools where it kind of emphasizes looking for the oolies in the car to to get the entrant. And, that is the wrong attitude. We're there, we're respecting our entrants. We want them to enjoy it. And we're not out there to, kind of get the entrant. And
that's true. That's true.
You
also mentioned that some PCA members, the big difference between PCA and MBCA is PCA people modify the cars a lot. They modify the engine compartment, they modify the bodywork, and they kind of look the other way because that's part and parcel of the success of the Porsche Club of America. We, on the other hand, are looking for authenticity. We're not looking for modifications. We do have a class of modified cars, but we don't really talk about it. We don't advertise it, but we do have it.
Yeah. PCA does not score authenticity at all. There's nothing off for authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
So it becomes only a cleanliness contest, and PCA judges are allowed, especially engine compartment judges, are allowed to run their hands all over the engine and obscure places, just kind of like the white glove treatment for the engine compartment,
right.
which
right.
is really bizarre. But, I've got a PCA Concours car, and so I'm quite kind of used to that. I was watching, last time I was in a Concours, I was watching the judge run his hands all over little cracks in the hood and all that. And I'm thinking, I've got smaller hands than you do. My hands have already been there. But we don't do that in Mercedes, and I prefer that. I really don't want people touching my car, and I don't think our entrants do. And we don't touch the cars. We don't damage the cars because of that. And that's one reason I like MBCA rules a lot better than I like PCA rules. Okay, everybody should be back now. And so let's get into the meat of the areas, the most frequently deducted areas, and the scoring breakdowns. Okay, so what I'm going to do is go through the various areas on the scoring sheet, talk about things that we often see that are deficient on those, and then go through some pictures and score things. Okay, so first let's do interior, upholstery, and trunk, and follow along on your score sheet as well, so you'll see the various categories. I'm going to go ahead and completely build the slide here and then talk about the items. Okay, there. So, a lot of our cars crack the dashes, especially 107s. And the other thing to look at for cars that are subject to cracked dashes is whether they've got some type of plastic dash overlay on them. You can usually see a lip on the edge of those, but so you'll need to know that, because especially 107s are very susceptible to cracked dashes, and at least half the ones I've looked at have had overlays on them, and very often the owners haven't even known they've had overlays. Instruments, instrument bezels, especially the ones that have plastic instrument bezels, the instruments will fade out from, especially the needles fade from the sun. Some of the ones have chrome around them and they get pitted. Heater control levers, 108s, 109s, the 60s cars, the Pagodas, the heater control levers tend to break the little knobs off. And so you want to look and make sure there's really four knobs there. One of the things you see a lot is a aftermarket radio. And sometimes you see speaker holes cut into places where they shouldn't be, like the horizontal area behind the seats in a 107. Wood finish, we expect the wood finish to look like it came from the factory, which is shiny, beautiful, uncracked, not delaminated. The sun visors, especially on some of the older cars, and again, 107s are kind of famous for sun visors that look like a balloon that's deflated. So, and headliner, especially convertibles where there's no separate headliner, it's not unusual to see a stain on the inside of the top where the top contacts either the storage compartment or the frame of the top. And fortunately, it's very easy to look at a car, look at the interior, and not look up to the headliner. And fortunately, though, your scoring sheet kind of will remind you to look at things like that. Incorrect upholstery changes, a car that was built with leather upholstery that has vinyl upholstery. Some of the cars that we look at, all of them had leather, and you look at a car that has vinyl, you might want to ask the owner about that. Condition of original upholstery. Leather is expected to have some cracks in it, but the cracks aren't to go through the color. And so if it's just got cracks on it, that's patina. If it's got cracks through the upholstery, that's a deficiency. Carpet, incorrect color is often you see, or condition of the original carpet, they tend to get wear holes where the feet are, or where your foot will hit the vertical right in front of the door. The trunk floor, the side panel finish, spare tire. Now note, a lot of the cars you can't see the spare tire, and if you're going to look at the spare tire in every car in the class, and for some of them you'll have to ask the owner to lift the bottom of the trunk so they can see the spare tire. But if you're going to look at one spare tire, you need to look at every spare tire in the class. And if you're going to look at one jack, you need to look at all the jacks. Toolkit, first aid kit, owner's manual. Note that you're not going to see first aid kits in the older cars probably before about 1972. And there's also a first aid kit delete option. And so if you see a car that doesn't have a first aid kit, you might want to ask the owner if it has that option. I think I've got 2 cars that have a first aid kit delete option. Okay, let's go over to some pictures here. I'm going to go ahead and build the slide here. And this is an example of some stains on the inside of the top and on the inside of the interior compartment. And sometimes it's from glue when the top was replaced. Very often it's just wear on the inside of the top frame. And for some of the cars that don't have chrome top frames, you can even see some rusty looking stains on the inside of the top from that. This is a great picture of in the center here, of a original Becker radio in the car, and the wood looks good. There's a little bit of, if you can see my cursor here, note this wood's a little bit different colored from that, but that could just be an anomaly of the picture. If you look at the picture on the right of the seat, look at that beautiful leather. It's a little patinaed. The cracks do not go through the color, so that's not a deficiency. And then look at the neat decal and tag on this handle. All right, let's go to the next picture here. And let me fully build the slide here. Now, note, I mentioned that a lot of the times these knobs aren't present because they just break off. So when you see this, take a look and see if all the knobs are there. I've got one of these cars that has a knob missing, so I know that happens. You'll often see an aftermarket radio. This would be some type of Becker with a chrome surround on it and buttons on it, not this slightly more modern radio. So that's a deficiency. It's an authenticity deficiency. And you should expect the clock to work. And often that's just seeing if it's telling the time that it is while you're judging. Now AC is an interesting one on these cars. I think this is a Pagoda. And the AC here is not period correct. If you look in the rule book, it says that we're judging the car as it came from the factory to the dealer. But it also says with some exception. The notable exception, I think the reason that's in the rules is because AC was a dealer installed option on cars of this vintage. So how do you know if it's okay or not? And let me show you a slide I stole from Bud's Bed's website. Now, generally, what the dealer was installing on these vintage cars was either a Coolmeister or a Frigid-King AC unit. And if you look at these pictures of the Coolmaster and the Frigid-King, there's one thing in common between them. The configuration is vent, panel, vent, panel, vent. Both of them, vent, panel, vent, panel, vent. And if you looked at the previous picture in the previous slide, you notice that's not this configuration. So that's a key to how you'd know that this isn't the dealer installed option, either Coolmeister or Frigid-King AC unit. And I'm going to show you a picture in just a little bit of another one that's not. Of course, this one has a knob missing, and this has got some, some issues with aftermarket radio and the wood. But this picture is specifically to give you a little recognition training on what a Coolmeister or a Frigid-King looks like.
Gary, I think I've got at least a couple of questions here in chat, and I think it's probably important here. One is from Reed. I mean, I answered it in chat, but I think for everybody, should the OEM radio be demonstrated to function?
Yeah, and I see Peach that Diana's answered that. We don't typically test things for function, although you can do that in show class. But if you were to do that as a judge, you have to test every radio in every car that you judge in that class for function if you're going to do that. I have not seen that generally done. We don't typically do that.
No, we don't ask owners to get in their cars and show us that. And maybe just for clarification as well, you have the big list of items, that are typically deducted. A question in private chat is are those all quarter-point deductions? Are they half-point deductions?
Well, yeah, let me talk through that, because I've got some pictures, and that's my next discussion point is, well, how much do you take off?
Right.
But the general answer to that question is you take off the amount that's appropriate for the area. And let's just roll over to this one, and I'll talk about that. That's the intent of the next several slides, is to address that question. We see a picture of a 129 interior here. And let's say we're the interior upholstery and trunk judge. And one of the issues would be, we're judging this car with the top down, and we don't judge the cars with the top down. We judge them with the top up. But aside from that, let's look at the driver's seat. If you look at the driver's seat here, you see cracks in the leather. Now, this is a gray seat, and the cracks are showing black. Okay, so it's cracked through the leather. And so that's a deficiency. It's a condition deficiency. The seats are authentic. If you look at the score sheet for seat coverings, there's 4 points for seat coverings. And so there's 2 seats, so it's probably 2 points a seat. And say if there's 2 points for the driver's seat, that's 1 point for authenticity and 1 point for condition. It's an authentic seat, so it's okay on authenticity. So you have 1 point to play with on condition. And it's generally okay, other than it's got this cracking. So you might take off, say, a quarter point for the cracking. And then if you look, there's a scar in the top of the headrest here. So, maybe you take a quarter point off for that scar. You move over to the passenger seat, there's some cracking there. So, maybe you take a quarter point off for that. And so this methodology of look at how much is on the score sheet for that area, see how much, pertains to what you're looking at, and then the split between authenticity and condition gives you guidance on how much you ought to be taking off. If you look over at steering wheel, gear shift, and signal stalks, which is a 2 point area, and you see this steering wheel has wear all the way around it here. And there's 2 points that split between steering wheel, stalks, and gear shift. So, how much of that steering wheel? Well, it's certainly not more than 1 point for the steering wheel, and that might be a little excessive. Of that 1 point, half would be authenticity and half would be condition. And so you have a half a point to work with, perhaps, on the steering wheel for condition. And of that, you know, it's generally all there, not scarred up too much, but it's got this wear all the way around here. So, you know, that's probably a 1/4 point for wear on the steering wheel. Looking over at the door inside coverings on your score sheet, that's a 2-point item. And the door inside covering here, let's see, there's a stain up here, and there's maybe staining or wear over here. So, you know, maybe if I've got 2 points max for the door inside coverings, 1 for authenticity, 1 for condition. Authenticity is probably good there. Condition, maybe a 1/4 for stain, a 1/4 for the dirt or something like that. So, you know, that's the kind of methodology you go through on this. The other thing you might notice is the radio says code, which means it's not functional. I might take off for that, but maybe a 1/4 point for that. But, you know, radio is kind of an interesting challenge, because if you look at your score sheet, dash including instruments, radio, clock, glove box, there's a lot of stuff in that 3 points. It's dash, it's all the instruments, it's glove box if the car has one, and it's radio. And so how much is the radio by itself? It's not a lot, you know, maybe less than a point. And so how much would you take off for a radio that says it needs to have the code entered? Maybe a 1/4.
Well, Gary, you know, chances are you would probably never see that, because that would require the car to be turned on for you to see that, right?
I don't think this one's on, but
because usually
this one's running. Yeah, you're right. You're right.
Yeah, because those wouldn't be lit. We do have a couple of questions going back to the air conditioner. This is always a sticky area. So Marie, so maybe go back to your Frigiking, your slide on the air conditioners on that pagoda.
Okay, so yeah, there's 2 AC questions here. Marie had her question, and her car was unique in that it had did not originally have AC. Someone put AC in it, and then she had the AC removed. And so how do you score that? And that really kind of depends on what you see when you look at the car. You know, there's probably going to be some penetrations in the firewall that weren't originally there. You might be able to hide them. You know, if you were doing the perfect restoration of a car that wasn't supposed to have AC and you're trying to cover it up, you know, you'd probably, you know, weld those holes up and make them invisible. So it kind of depends on what you see when you look at the car. So I can't really answer that question without. There's no blanket answer to that one without saying, you know, what you can see of it on the car. Sam's question was, how about if, say, a 60s car has an older AC system from the 60s, but is not dealer installed, still period correct, but not official Frigiking or Coolmeister? Yeah, I'd take off something for that. But realize, you know, in an interior upholstery trunk, there's nothing there that says AC. And so where is that? I'd say it's probably, since they're under dash units, in dash including instruments, radio, clock, glove box, and the maximum points is only 3 in there. You know, I'm going to show you an example of exactly that in a couple more slides, and I'd say maybe a 1/4. You know, maybe some people might take off a 1/2, but you know, it can't be that much because the max points in that area isn't that much. So there's no big penalty for it. Okay, if we don't test functionality, why take off for code? Well, if you were going to, then you'd have to take it off for every one. And Diana correctly pointed out that I'd never see that anyway, so it's a moot point. So I was getting a little bit off track there. So ignore what I said.
Pete,
Thank
Gary?
you.
Yeah, Pete's got his hand up.
Pete.
Yeah, Gary, for the question, the First Lady about air conditioning that's been removed, usually there's a special bracket that goes for the air conditioner on a pagoda. And that bracket is a very hefty piece of cast iron that actually covers the area where your lower hose for your that goes from the water from the, let's see, it goes from, anyways, the lower hose is about 1 inch long. If it covers that area, then I would take off for it because it shouldn't have that bracket on there. It's a pain in the neck to remove, but it should be removed if you're not going to have air conditioning.
Thank you, Pete. Appreciate that.
Right. Yeah, we've got another question here from Marie. I think is a good question. And when we're talking about this, how should we judge options? What the car was originally manufactured with, original dealer installs, or as long as it is period and model correct, is it acceptable? This is always a common question.
Yeah, I mean, generally, you expect the car to be shown with the options that the car's data code says on it. There's a specific exception for optional wheels. If the wheel was an option, that wheel is okay. Dealer installed options are typically the AC system, and it's really the only dealer installed option that I am familiar with that we think is okay. And I'm going to show you an example a little bit later of pinstriping, and a lot of 107s came with pinstriping, and I'd kind of take off for it, even though it was probably a dealer installed item. And so I don't think it's generally okay for period and model correct if it wasn't built with it. But most of us aren't going to notice that. And so the practicality of it is that if it was something that was available in the car and it's on the car, we're probably not going to know, because we're probably not going to audit it per the option code sheet unless someone sees something a little unusual. Pete, is that an okay answer?
Yeah, Gary, a good example would be a right-hand mirror that was installed on a restoration on a Pagoda or another car of that vintage. It was available as an option. It would have to be on the original purchase sheet, but we don't judge it. We don't bother with it. Another example, let's see. There aren't too many examples of cars of that vintage, really. You find it on later model cars, but again, it's not a problem unless it stands out. Then when I have to ask the question to the owner, I said, was this car originally equipped with this? They said, no, I added it. You still don't want to take off for it if it's something that was available that year. So it's not something we get hung up on so much.
Yeah, and there can be some unusual things. Like I know Eric's 300 SEL 3.5/4.5 European delivery car, and it's got some European things on it, and it's got some US things on it. And that's a good one to ask the entrant if you even pick up on it.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a couple other good, I think, some questions here that are kind of Jim and Scott. I think these are kind of related. If you have a different place for dirt, dust, and stains on the interior, would you also deduct points for the door inside covering stain? Seems like double counting. And Scott has basically the same question. I always struggle with. So if cracks go on the seat, but dirt goes in the dirt column, we don't really have a dirt column, right?
Well, and you really can't, what you really can't do is you can't double penalize somebody for something. And that's really the key. I mean, if there's a deficiency, you ought to document and penalize for the deficiency, but you can't do it twice.
Yeah, and I think Wesley has a good question here too, and I don't know that I've seen this, but I'm not even sure how you determine. How do you judge a Pagoda that shows the option code of not having a soft top installed from the factory, but currently has one? I don't
Well,
so, I mean, you'd have to see the build sheet, right? You'd need to see the build sheet and examine it pretty carefully.
Yeah, I mean, would anyone ever actually really pick up for that unless it's a California car that wasn't supposed to have one, and they don't have wells? So,
Right.
The practical nature, you're not going to really figure that out, I don't think, because we don't typically audit the option codes versus the car.
Right, or most people don't even have the build sheet, right? You wouldn't even know
Yeah.
that that's where the car came.
Yeah, no, we wouldn't figure that out.
Yeah. Oh, here's a great question from Greg Toma. As an entrant, is it smart to bring the build sheet to a concourse?
Yeah, I would. I need to document my first aid kit delete.
Mm-hmm.
But I've gotten penalized for that before. But okay, well, let me go on a little bit. Have we answered the questions up to now?
Yes, we have.
And some of these I'll end up answering, I hope, through these other pictures and discussions. And you can also see that there's places where different judges may deduct some different amount. It's not going to be a lot different. We may disagree between a half or a quarter a point, but given the scoring sheet and our methodology, the same car with different judges is going to be scored about the same. And that's kind of what we want. All right, so let me go on to the next little picture here. Okay, this is, I put this one in specifically for the covering on the steering wheel, although there's some other things in this picture other than the covering on the steering wheel. And so what are you going to do with that steering wheel? All right, let's think about the methodology of the score sheet. You know, we're under interior upholstery trunk. Under steering wheel, gear shift, signal stalks, there's a maximum of 2 points. You know, that's spread between all those three of the items. So how much is the steering wheel itself? Maybe a maximum of 1 point for the steering wheel. We've got a non-authenticity issue in that it's got that tied on leather cover. It's also got, it's got a crack here. It's got a blemish in here on the horn pad. And it might have a little bit of chrome pitting here. So if there's 1 point for the steering wheel, say, well, that's a half point for originality and a half point for condition. And we've got maybe an originality issue with the cover, so maybe that's a quarter, and we've got a crack, and we've got a blemish, and we've got a blemish. But if you start adding all that up into a quarter, a quarter, a quarter, you're really penalizing more than the steering wheel is worth. So you've got to be very sensitive to the maximum amount of points something might be worth, and don't overdo the penalizing if you add up. Because, you know, if you took off a total of 1 point here for a steering wheel that's worth about 1 point, well, it's not really fair. I mean, they've got a steering wheel. It's really kind of correct for the car. It's really in generally okay condition. You can't just take all the points off for the steering wheel. And so, you know, you have to be very judicious about the way you're doing this. I might do a quarter for the cover, you know, a quarter for the crack and blemish, and that's probably where I'd stop. Because otherwise, you know, you take off all the points of the steering wheel and it doesn't justify it. The other thing to look at over here is an aftermarket radio. You know, probably some cracks up here. The wood looks not that great. So, but I really put this one in for the steering wheel cover. All right, let's go on to this nice picture. All right, this is a very pretty pagoda. And note the AC unit. I put this one in because note the configuration. This is vent, panel, vent, vent, vent. And if you looked at the Frigid King and the Coolmeister, it was vent, panel, vent, panel, vent. It was vent, panel, vent, panel, vent. And so this isn't a Frigid King or a Coolmeister. And so to get at the question of, well, how about a period correct but not dealer installed item? Well, that's what this is. And where are you going to put that? Well, there's no AC line in interior. I'd say it's probably dash, including instruments, radio clock, glove box, which is a 3-point area. And so, you know, 1.5 points for authenticity, 1.5 points for condition. For all of that stuff, all those instruments, the radio, the glove box, the dash, all of that, including it. So, you know, to put it in perspective, maybe that's a 1/4 point off for authenticity, and, you know, assuming the condition's okay. Put your deductions in perspective to the max points for the area. And, you know, some people might take off a 1/2 point for that, but, you know, it's probably a 1/4 point item to get at the answer to that question. And notice, you know, there's safety items that are added to the car. You know, if this was a pre-68 car, it wouldn't have steering seat belts. Well, this one has seat belts. Well, you don't take off for safety equipment. That's one of the provisions in the rules. And mandatory safety equipment that's been added to the car, there's no penalty for that, of course. Okay, we'll go to another interior picture. This is a 129, and not a lot to criticize in this one. Maybe 2 things. The thing that caught my eye, is this, see this little net that is for storage? There's actually 4 little things that connect this. There's 2 little plastic pieces in here that this goes around, and those 2 little plastic pieces have pulled out. That's why it's sitting over like that. So where is that on the interior upholstery trunk? Well, I think that's probably under carpeting, since it sticks into the carpeting. Nothing. There's 2 points max for carpeting. The storage net missing its attachment points, you know, maybe a 1/4. And looking at this car, it's actually pretty good. One thing you notice on 129s is that this knob over here is often missing. It's actually on. That's what releases this armrest to slide out, and it often breaks off and is often missing, and it's on in this car. Notice that there's an area on the door covering where the carpeting's been scuffed by the person's foot getting in, and so that's probably over on the door inside coverings, and that's maybe a quarter. I mean, that's a whole 2 points for both door inside coverings, so don't overly penalize that one either. Okay, all right, I put this in for one reason. Okay, we're doing interior, and trunk finish coverings is 1 point. Okay, this is a 107, and does anyone see what's wrong here? Just jumps out at you? You can just unmute and say it if you see it. Okay, if you don't see it. Okay, this 107's trunk lids, interiors are black. And I think that's the same on pagodas as well. You should expect this area to be black. And this car actually had a color change as well. And the shop that did the color change didn't know that they weren't supposed to paint the inside of the trunk lid. And so this should just leap out at you if you're familiar with judging these cars. All right, let's go elsewhere here. Okay, so that's interior, and I don't see any new, are there new questions? I don't have my chat window very big. Okay.
No new questions, go on.
Looks like we can go on. Okay, let's do paint and coach work. Okay, so flip your score sheet to paint and coach work. And this is the area where you don't quite have the same split between condition and authenticity because of the nature of what the items are, if you look at what's on the sheet. The things that you see in paint and coach work are obviously stone chips. You have to be careful on stone chips because you know, that's generally imperfections in paint. That's a 5-point area, but it's pretty easy to add up too many points off for stone chips on especially street category. You're looking at the fit of the body, the gaps, the left to the right fenders, the doors. You can expect to see chips. You've got to look at the rocker panel fits, the lines that go down the side of the car. I mean, fender gaps, hood gaps, trunk gaps are something I always look at on a Mercedes, and you know they come from the factory perfect. I mean, the Mercedes look very, very good when they come from the factory. And what happens if the car gets damaged is a body shop that isn't quite up to snuff might not get the gaps quite right. And so that's kind of what you're looking for there. Orange peel, you know, other than in some of the obscure places like door jambs, these cars do not come with orange peel exterior in the paint. And if you don't know what orange peel is, I'm going to show you that in the next picture. And of course, you're looking at the condition of the paint, swirl marks, chips, runs, although you probably won't see that. And a lot of the time for the condition of the paint, you've got to get in a place where you can shine light off of it to see what the paint really looks like. And that discloses little dents and things like that. So try to do that if you're judging this area. And of course, the correct color for the car model. And as I mentioned, Diana is going to forward a paint code listing with some of the information from this course. And I dragged this picture off of an eBay ad, and what I'm not trying to show you is the cracking in the middle of it. What I'm trying to show you is if you look up in here and shine the light off of it, see how that kind of looks like the surface of an orange? And it's even that way down here too, but that's what orange peel is. And you know, Mercedes do not come from the factory with a finish generally that looks like that. And so that's a deduction in this area. Okay, some other paint and coachwork items. Gaps. This is a picture of the same car comparing the left hood gap to the right hood gap, and notice they're just not the same. And it did not come from the factory that way. And chrome strips. You know, this strip on the door edge did not come from the factory on the car. And pagodas. At least half of the pagodas I've ever looked at have been missing this little notch that's on the inside by the headlight on both sides. And What happens is if the car goes to a restorer that's not familiar with Mercedes-Benz automobiles and especially Pagoda, they won't realize that's there. And when they're refinishing the body, that little swedge or notch will go away. And so when you're judging a Pagoda, always look for that. At Hilton Head last year, I think there were 3 Pagodas, and I think at least 2 of them were missing that little swedge mark that really ought to be there. Also, I think at least 2 of them had polished aluminum cam covers instead of the regular dull finish that comes from the factory. Okay, over to wheel cover. Now, it's okay to have white walls. It's okay to have black walls. You know, we don't care about that. But what's not okay on this one is this chrome hubcap is not supposed to be chrome in here and in here. These hubcaps are painted body color. And so that's a deficiency. And I'll show you another picture of a deficiency in that area in a minute. Okay, sight lines across the bodywork, they come from the factory straight. I mean, that's one of the hallmarks of Mercedes, good body gaps that are all consistent and straight lines. So look at that as if you're judging this and judge to see that they're still straight. Notice that this car has chrome on the fender lip. Now that's correct for this car. I think this is a 600. After 1973, you don't see any cars that came from the factory with a chrome fender lip. It's only some 60s cars, mostly coupes and cabriolets, that had this, and all 600s. What you frequently see is a 107 that will have these fender lips, and that's not correct ever for a 107. All right, next slide. Okay, let's look at some pictures and talk about scoring a little bit. All right, so look at the side of this car. This is subtle, but if you're looking at the lines, look at the front door gap to the back door gap. Okay, the back door gap is a little smaller, and it's a little lower in here. The other thing, if you see something like that especially, you know, that's probably due to some type of accident damage that wasn't really quite repaired right. So the other thing you start looking for is, did they match the paint right? And what I think I see here, and it's hard to do for a picture, if you could walk around it'd be a little easier, but notice this door looks a little darker than what's around it. And so, you know, I'd probably take off under gaps. If you look at the score sheet, doors, hood, deck lid, 2 points max. So I'd probably take off a 1/4 point for the rear door gap. Under paint color, 2 points max. The door paint doesn't match, so yeah, I'd probably take off a 1/4 for that. Now, one other thing to point out here, note that this car appears to be missing a lug bolt. And under wheels, wheel covers, 1 point max, I'd probably take off a 1/4 point for that. And that I'd probably tell the owner about, because that's kind of a safety issue. And, you know, I really wasn't considering the dent back here. You probably will never see a Concours car with a dent like that. Now, if you're in doubt on one of these cars about gaps, you know, look at the other side. This is the other side of the same car. And notice how the door gaps are much more consistent on this side, and the paint color is much more consistent. Also consistent is the missing lug bolt over here. Which, this was an eBay ad, so this wasn't a Concours competitor. Okay, here's one that I took. This is Amelia, and this is a 300 SL. Look at the hood gap here and here. And if you think this is an anomaly from where I took the picture, I took the same picture of the 300 SL on the other side of it, and it also, and it did not have hood gaps that look like this in the picture. And so, you know, in our Concours, that's probably, you know, 1/4 point off. It's under gaps, doors, hood, deck lid, which is a 2 points max, and, you know, maybe that's probably a 1/4 point. And so you see that even at the highest level of Concours. Let's see, I think there's a question there. In a Eric mentions in a 2-tone car, the hubcaps may be the top color. Okay, good, thank you. Eric knows this a lot better than I do. All right, here's a picture. Now you are judging paint Coachwork. The first thing that should strike you is that the top is down. We judge the cars with the top up, to be fair, because sometimes in the same class we'll have coupes and convertibles, and it wouldn't be fair to have the top down for the convertibles and not judge that part of the car. And so we asked the entrant in this case to put the top up. Now, other things to look at on this one. And note that this hubcap is not the same color as the body, and it's supposed to be. So, under wheels, wheel covers, which is 1 point max, probably take off a 1/4 point for that. The other thing I'll point out on this one, and I mentioned previously, pinstriping. A lot of 107s have pinstriping. And I'm pretty sure they didn't come from the factory with pinstriping. And I would deduct a 1/4 point for that pinstriping under quality of body work, 3 points max. And another comment on this one, under if you were the glass, lights, rubber, and trim judge, side trim, antenna, side mirrors. And there's 2 points max in there. And if you look at this antenna, okay, now this antenna is bent, but beware, okay? If you were to decide to penalize this car for the bent antenna, you need to go look at every car's antenna in your class. And this is one of the very few 107s I've seen that does not have a power antenna. That's why the antenna is sitting up. Most of the time you're judging cars with the antennas down because the ignition's off and they have power antennas. So you can't just go penalize this car for having a bent antenna unless you look at all the rest of the antennas. And as owner of this car, I might just put the antenna down if it were being judged. Okay, and that's an important point. Let me reemphasize the consistency of judging idea here. In 107s, some of them have batteries in the front, some of them have batteries in the trunk. You can't see the battery in the trunk. And so you really can't judge the battery in the engine compartment if you have cars in the same class with the battery in the trunk. That goes for 124 sedans. The V8s had the battery in the trunk. The 6s had the battery in the engine compartment. If you've got cars that have batteries in the trunk where you can't see the battery, you don't judge the batteries even on the ones that are in the engine compartment for consistency. I mean, consistency is key to what we're doing here, and always keep that in mind. I think I saw a question.
Yeah, we got a question here from Rusty. This always comes up with 107s, okay, about the pinstriping. What about dealer added pinstriping?
Yeah, we're really, in this case, judging the car as it came from the factory, and I would take off for the pinstripes. Now, the chief judge can standardize and say, no, we're not going to do that if the chief judge wants to do that. But, it's kind of not like the dealer added AC. It's kind of an extra, profit center for the dealer and not really an aspect of what Mercedes is providing on their cars.
Yep. And we got a couple other questions here about, which is good. How do you handle an SL if it has the hard top in place?
You have the option when participating in our concours to either have the hard top in place or the soft top up. And for example, I've got a 600 SL that has cracks in the rear window, and so if I concours that, I put the hard top on it, and that's perfectly acceptable.
Yeah, and then the other question is about fog lights on the 107. Are those factory or were they added on?
I don't think I have ever seen a 107 that did not have fog lights, and I think they came with it. I should also mention that in street class, additional driving lights are acceptable in any case, but I don't think I've ever seen one of these that didn't have these. And one of the things you can just do is do a Google search for images of these cars, and they basically all have them. And so I think they came with them. Okay, any other questions? Yeah, there's from Ruben said, all US spec 107s have fog lights. Okay, that's kind of what I thought. All right, any other questions before I proceed?
No, go on.
Okay, let me take a sip here. All right, let me roll into this one. Okay, so you are judging paint coach work. And what I wanted to point out on this one, look at the trunk gap. See how the trunk sits up a little bit here? Okay, and that's a body line gap issue. You have 2 points max in there. And for the trunk gap up a little bit like that, I maybe take a 1/4 point off. Other things to look at on this one, quality of body work, 3 points there. And you may not be able to see it very well, but there's some fairly substantial rust bubbling here and in here. And I might take off a 1/2 point for that because it's pretty substantial in 2 areas under quality of body work. Now, What if you're the judge for glass, lights, rubber, and trim? Now look at the back bumper. The rear bumper and guards is 2 points max. Now, this is a 1970 300 SEL. It's not supposed to have these vertical bumper guards on it. And so you've got 2 points to spread across rear bumpers and guards. And you've got this big rear bumper, and you've got the real guards here. And then you've got these awful vertical guards that aren't supposed to be on the car, and oh, by the way, are also in bad condition. So you have to kind of judge, well, how much of those 2 points are for these things? And, is it 1 point? Is it less than 1 point? But they're both not authentic, and they're in bad condition. And so I might even take off as much as 1 point for that, although maybe that's a little bit excessive. Some people might take 3/4 or maybe a half point off for them, but they're not supposed to be on the car, and they're in bad condition as well. The other thing to mention in this, look at the exhaust. See how the exhaust is dented? Now, if you're in street class, okay, so you're judging and you see that, well, you're in street class. We don't judge exhaust in street class, so you ignore it. If this is show class and you're doing chassis and underbody and the exhaust is dented, well, there's only 1 point in exhaust in show class, and so maybe that's 1/4. Okay, for dented exhaust tip. All right, next shot. And this one is to talk about OEM soft tops. And I've got a picture. This is a 129 on the left, and on the right is a 107. And in both cases, what you see is an embossed feature in each of the plexiglass windows, or plastic windows, that shows it's an original OEM Mercedes window. And you will run across in Mercedes Concours where it's a beautiful top, the fabric looks good, the windows are nice and clear, and they don't have these embossed indicators that show you that it's an original Mercedes top. And people do that because it's a bit cheaper. So how much do you deduct for that? And reasonable people can differ on this one, but let's use the logic of the score sheet. This is under paint and coachwork, and it's roof including soft top, and there's 2 points allocated for max on this. And of that 2 points, 1 is condition and 1 is authenticity. The condition is good, so we have the 1 point of authenticity to work with. So would you take off a whole point? Well, it's really kind of got a correct fabric on it. It just doesn't have the Mercedes seal on that. So, is that a half point? Is that a 1/4 point? It could either be a half or a 1/4. And this is a good place for the chief judge to say, for this concours, we're going to do this amount off for that. But, it's not, I don't think it's 1 point off for authenticity because, the fabric is, looks like the right fabric to me. So this is a good one for the chief judge to mention in a judges meeting because you'll almost certainly see this issue in a concours. Looking for questions.
Yeah, I think you cover this later, but I'll ask it anyhow. Rusty asks, how much do you take off for non-Mercedes glass? Should that be the same for a non-Mercedes plastic window?
Well, it doesn't. There's a specific item in the rules about in street class that non-OEM glass of the same fit function is okay. And it doesn't say that for the tops. And so it really isn't the same, although, if we rewrote the rules, it could be. So in that case, you'd use if you're in street class, then you don't take anything off for a non-OEM window. And in show class, you'd expect a Mercedes window. But we're also in a different part of the score sheet when you're in windows. This paint and coachwork, the discussion here for the Mercedes top is under paint, coachwork, roof, including soft top. And if you're talking about window glass, you're under glass, lights, rubber, chrome, trim. You got to flip the score sheet over and look at what the scoring there is, which is windows, side and rear, seats, trim, and windshield, seal, and trim. Windshield seal and trim is 2 points. Windows, side, and rear seats trim is 2 points. And so you've got to take off the right amount in proportion to that maximum score. I see some more questions popping in. Oh, Pete's raised his hand. Go ahead, Pete. You're still muted, Pete. We can't hear you.
How's that?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. The question the lady asked about the window glass, I think she might have been referring to the windshield. I've never, ever seen a Mercedes have non-Mercedes side windows installed in them because they're such a size and shape and finish. I've never seen that in all the years I've been looking at these cars. It'd be highly unusual. But on the windshield, there's a separate distinction on that. Are you going to go over that as well?
Why don't you go over that? I don't have a specific slide for that.
Okay. As far as windshields are concerned, it should have the Mercedes-Benz logo on the windshield, lower left-hand corner. Sometimes it may not have the star, but it's going to be made by West German company like Koenig Glass or something like that. At any rate, it should not be devoid of any script at all in the lower left-hand corner, and it should not be made by, well, a U.S. glass manufacturer, which there's plenty of them out there that are available, and it's cheaper to buy a non-Mercedes windshield glass than it is a Mercedes window glass. You got to be careful now because some of the Mercedes are built in the USA, so they could actually be window glass made by a U.S. supplier, but they should still have the nomenclature in the lower left-hand corner that would indicate that it's original Mercedes.
Okay. Thank you very much for filling that in.
Okay.
All right, so let's go on a little bit. Okay, I wanted to highlight this one to show how you have to shine the light off the side of the car to see the imperfections in the paint. And there's a door ding here, and there's a door ding here. And you'd never pick up on them if you didn't do this. Now for this car, you're judging paint and coach work. You're under quality of body work, which is a maximum of 3 points. And, 2 door dings, maybe you take off a quarter, two iterations of a quarter. But I caution you here, if you looked carefully at this car, there's just a ton of door dings on this car. And you could easily take off more than is appropriate. In fact, you could add up more points than 3 on the door dings of this car. And so you just can't blindly say take off a quarter per door ding. You've always got to keep what you take off in proportion to the maximum points in that area. And that goes for every item. And so I see some discussion about bumper guards. Yeah, there's a discussion in chat about bumper guards on 300 SELs, but you note that the 300 SEL 6.3s do not have those vertical bumper guards or the factory grills on it. In fact, I've got another slide on that in here to talk about. Anyway, let's move over to chassis. And I don't have a lot of pictures on this one, but what are you going to see in chassis? And I'll point out there's only 1 point in chassis for let me get to
each of these category.
There's only 1 point in here for dirt, and so the rest of it's all 1 point for all these items. You might see on the springs, paint marks on them because it's really hard to read the part numbers on these springs, and so they tend to have color codes for which springs they are. That's perfectly normal and came from the factory that way. And you're kind of looking for corrosion or leaks or what the suspension looks like. But there's very few points in here, only 1 point for oil and leaks and dirt. And so don't be deterred from entering the show classification here, because it's really about maintaining your car properly and not so much about making it cleanly. Okay, let's go over to glass, lights, rubber, chrome, trim, and there's a lot of stuff in here, and that's why it's its own separate category. Okay, I'll build the entire slide here and then talk through a few of these. The plastic grill inserts can often get discolored. Also, what you see sometimes is dents on the chrome because of rocks hitting them. Now, cracked headlight door and what Mercedes calls headlight door for US spec car, there's often a plastic headlight surround, and that's called the headlight door. And they get cracked and crazed, and sometimes they just aren't fitted right. I mentioned European headlights. European headlights in street class are okay. In show class, the car is supposed to have the headlights that it came with. So if it's a Euro car, it's supposed to have Euro headlights. If it's not a Euro car, it's not supposed to have Euro headlights. Headlights match, fit, cracks in the window shield, and this is pertinent to our discussion about windshields. The correct windshield, fender lip chrome, because most of the cars don't have fender lip chrome. You often see 107s with them. Overspray, if the car hasn't been painted by a really first-class body shop, you might find some overspray, especially on the door seals or in the door jambs. You might also see some marks where the masking wasn't done very well in that area. And I've got a good picture of what good taillight fit looks like. Sometimes the cars are supposed to have bumper overriders, sometimes they don't. If in doubt, ask your team leader. The team leader can ask the entrant, or can ask the chief judge. Our chief judge knows this bumper overrider thing pretty well. Antennas, Hirschman's versus the others, although you often won't see that. There's also that little piece of rubber that's on top of the antenna that often gets cracked and sometimes isn't even present. So let's go to some other items here in pictures. This is a 600. Look how nicely everything's lined up and what the chrome looks like. This is a very nice example. And notice a 600 has chrome fender lips. Now here is a 280 SE, not supposed to have chrome fender lips. And the rule book actually mentions which cars are supposed to have front chrome fender lips. And they're pretty much the older coupes and convertibles and all the 600s. So there's nothing after 73 that has chrome fender lips. All right, let's look at this car. Okay, this is a Pagoda. This happens to be a 1970 280 SL. Now I have to specify 1970 because of these wheels. These wheels are not available before 1970, but if you read the little note at the bottom on the score sheet, these are okay 1970 beyond because they're an option. But the reason I put this one in here is to spark the discussion item. Let's say you're the glass lights rubber chrome trim judge, and you have determined by talking to the entrant that this is a US spec car, and what the entrant has done is to have the side marker lights deleted and the bumper overriders deleted. How are you going to score that? Well, I mean, there's no provision in the rules that really kind of allows you to do that even in street class. And of course, you may not pick up for it because it looks like a Euro spec car. If you hadn't asked the entrant that, you would probably never know. But, okay, so let's look at the score sheet. Headlights, signaling, fog lights is a 2 points max. Side markers are deleted. And assuming everything else is okay in that area, it's probably a 1/4 point off for side markers deleted. All right, so let's look at rear bumper guards. That's a 2 points max. And so how are you going to split that between guards and bumpers? Well, maybe it's a point for bumpers and a point for bumper guards. If that were the case, well, bumper guards aren't there. You really can't judge their condition or their authenticity. Obviously, they're not there. So, that could be as much as a 1 point deduction. And, maybe you want to talk to the chief judge a little bit about that one because that's a little bit unusual. But I just picked this one out to bring that up because I knew that those were deleted when the car was restored. Since we're here, let's say you're off at the paint and coachwork judging. Look at the top. You don't usually see tops that look like that. It's wrinkled. It has a somewhat opaquer window, and the window itself is wrinkled. So the top score sheet, 2 points for the top. Authenticity, let's assume it's an OEM top. We can't really see that very well. So you have 1 point to play with on condition. And so what might you take off there? Maybe half point for wrinkled and opaque rear window, something like that. Okay, let me go on. I see that we have some questions.
Yeah, we've got some questions here, and we've got some questions here, kind of going some general things. Let's see. I probably don't know the answer to some of these. At least I don't know. I'm not real familiar with the 190 SLs. About with your trip asks if you get extra credit for having factory yellow dots underneath the car on a 190 SL.
I don't know what that's about.
Yeah, I don't either. Maybe I don't either. Maybe Peter. Okay, go ahead and talk with Pete. Maybe you can.
Yeah. One thing I did.
Pete, you went back muted again. We can't hear you.
The gas cap is not a locking gas cap. It should have a locking gas cap. That was standard on the pagodas.
Oh, I missed that. Okay.
Yeah, you can see it from here. It's not a locking gas cap. I would take off of that too.
Ah. Okay.
But you're right. It's a U.S. car. I assume it's a U.S. car.
Yeah, this is a U.S. car.
Without the side markers removed. Does look better, but it's not correct.
Yeah.
Now, overriders in 70 and 71 were standard on pagodas, on U.S. spec pagodas.
Mm-hmm.
More than likely, they're missing from the front as well.
Yeah, I didn't grab that front picture, but yeah, it's amazing what you can do with Bring a Trailer. That's where I got a lot of these pictures.
Mm-hmm.
There's a couple other questions here.
Yeah, we've got here from Rita. I think we're talking about assume correct for gray market cars converted to an entry would be European lights, ? Also deduct for added side markers. I think.
Gray market car. Okay, so when it was brought into the United States, it would have been converted to U.S. lights.
Maybe not. The European lights, or they might have been put back in European after they got here, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably ask the entrant and defer to the entrant and give them the benefit of the doubt on that one.
Yeah, and I probably wouldn't deduct for side markers.
Pete raised his hand on that one. Again.
Yeah, actually, a lot of the cars that were brought in early on in the imported early on were required to meet all the U.S. specs. So they would have side markers added, and you can't take off of that because that was put on mandated by the U.S. government. Cars later on that were brought in didn't require it. So you have to ask the question, when was this car federalized? And if it was federalized prior to a certain point, it could have side markers installed.
Yep.
And Scott asked a real good. Scott Martin asked a real good general question about is there an authoritative description of as delivered from the factory components that we can use for reference? Googling may yield incorrect results. I think Eric kind of said sales brochures and order sheets are available for most cars from the 60s on. But the best thing to do is to use the build sheet if it's available. I mean, most people don't have the build sheet, so.
And I guess, so this is Scott Martin. So this is the one area after doing the course, I guess it was 2 years ago now, I felt inadequate in knowing, and this is a perfect example, I could look at it and judge the condition and quality and authenticity of Mercedes versus aftermarket parts, but the extra bumper guards, I would have no idea if I wasn't partnered with someone that knew. In 70 they didn't have them, but in 72 they added. I would have no idea that would be an area of judging.
I don't think anyone has all the answers to that, and I certainly don't. Eric is pretty good at this, and Pete's very, very good at it, but they'll also admit they don't have all the answers either. It's kind of a learning process. We give the entrant the benefit of the doubt on it. We consult with the chief judge as we have questions. We ask the entrant, but you won't know all that, I don't think. Pete, did you want to add to that? I see that you're unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, actually, it's tough to know all those answers to those questions. For example, the early 107s, 72s, and 73s have bumpers and overriders.
Yep.
But the European models do not have overriders. Don't ask me why. That's the way they were built. As far as pagodas are concerned, the overriders were an option. I think I could be wrong, but I think it was up to 1970. And so 70 and 71 should have overriders front and rear. And 68 and 69 was an option, but most of the cars had them. Not so true with the 250 or 230 SL, definitely true for the 280 SL. And that's the only thing I can go by. What I think I know, I don't think it's written anywhere. I don't think it's documented anywhere. Do the best you can. And if you're not sure, you err on the side of the entrance.
And in fact, this next car I rolled in here, this is an overrider issue and why I put this one in.
Oh, yeah.
This is a, okay, you're judging glass, lights, rubber, and trim. This is a 300 SEL 6.3. Okay, 6.3s don't have overriders in the front, and they don't have that grille protector. That didn't come from the factory with that. So what do you do with it? So you've got, if you look at the score sheet, grille, front bumper, guards, and emblems, 4-point max. And so you're spreading 4 points over, emblem, big grille, these things which are really the overriders, and the whole big horizontal grille, and then these things aren't supposed to be there, including this bolt that one broke off of. And so what do you do with it? And so I might take off maybe, a quarter for these things that are there that aren't supposed to be there for authenticity. And oh, by the way, it's also in really bad shape, so I might take that off too. But you can't overdo it either, because you only have 4 points to work with in that whole area, and it's split between authenticity and condition. Now, looking at other things in this car in that area, headlights, signaling, and fog lights, that's 2 points max. You look at this and you realize the two fog light lenses are not the same color. And so, that's probably a quarter point off. One of them is not right. Windshield, seal, and trim, 2 points max. The chrome surround on the windshield is quite dull, and you can't see it, but these cars are distinctive, and they have chrome trim all the way back here too. Can't see it in this picture, but that's also kind of dull. So maybe a quarter point for the windshield trim being dull. Windshield wipers aren't parking in the right place. So where is that? That's not really called out on the score sheet. I'd probably put that under windshield, seal, and trim, and maybe take a quarter point off for that. But it's hard to know about bumper overriders, and I've just learned this, recently, mostly from Eric, and it helps that I just bought this car, so I kind of know what's appropriate on that one. And I rolled this one in here to mention the European headlights, which I've already talked about. This does look a little odd, European headlights with a U.S. bumper. And that's okay in street class, and in show class, you might take off, maybe a quarter point for it, since we're in an area, headlights, signaling, fog lights has a maximum of 2 points. And note the hood gap on this one too. Doesn't quite look right. Now, in reality, you'd walk to the other side of the car and see if the other side hood trim looked like that too or not, or the hood gap looked like that, but that might be a quarter point off under paint and Coachwork for the hood gap. And let's roll over to this next 107. Does this look a little odd? This line right here on the grill is chrome on these cars. So what's going on here? Either we have an aftermarket grill in the car, or somebody's painted over the chrome. So how do you score that? Well, there's a maximum of 4 points in here for glass, lights, rubber, chrome trim, and grill, emblem, front bumper, guards. So maybe one of those points is for the grill, half of that's authenticity, half of it's condition. So, is it an inauthentic grill, or is it a grill that somebody's painted over? And so you could justify maybe a half point off if it's an inauthentic grill, or maybe you could justify a condition degrade of a half a point if it's a original grill and somebody's painted it over. All right, let's go over to my favorite, the engine compartment. And to build the slide up here, the kind of things you see here, and you see a lot of stuff in the engine compartments. As far as leaks, corrosion, fan belts that don't look like the original German type, the fuel stain. I don't think I've ever seen a 107 that didn't have corrosion on the exhaust manifold. Oftentimes on the brake booster, if there's been some leakage from the master cylinder, you see some paint that's been under it that's been removed and some rust because of that. Air filters often, either air filters end up being rusty, or sometimes you see air filters, the aluminum ones, that have been shined too much and they're really glossy instead of the dull finish that comes from the factory. Batteries are an interesting issue. We probably had more discussion about batteries than anything else. And the battery is supposed to be an OEM battery. So if you see AutoZone, Walmart, something like that, you know, that's not a correct battery for the car. You also have to look at the battery hold downs. A lot of our cars have, you know, bright chrome ends on the ignition wires that if they use aftermarket sets are going to get deleted. Some other items, the firewall grommets, and I mentioned the over polishing of aluminum. You see that on Pagodas. You see it sometimes on 107s where they've made the aluminum very, very shiny, and it just doesn't come from the factory that way. You roll into in yellow cad that looks like it's spray painted instead of cadmium plated. Hose clamps. And one of the frequent things you see is the wrong type of hose clamp. I'm not sure if you've ever noticed, but Mercedes hose clamps are different. You know, the American car hose clamps we call Yankee clamps, and they are often open so that you can see the rubber, and they don't have the little ridge around the side that the Mercedes clamps have. On black painted components, often the refinishing of things in the engine compartment, you end up with glossy black instead of kind of a semi-gloss black. I remember Pete and I were looking at a car at Amelia this year, and Pete's comment was, is it supposed to be that shiny? Because we were talking about the radiator, and the radiators really aren't that shiny. It's kind of a semi-gloss. You can often see overspray inside the engine compartment if the paint hasn't been masked well and the car's been repainted. Ignition coils are often very distinctive on our cars, often blue or red instead of the typical black. Wiring harnesses are subject to damage, and hood springs, I mean 107 hood springs are typically the car color. Okay, and let's go through some examples. Great pictures here. Note that this chrome is not an original Mercedes item. And note here, this is yellow cadmium plating here. This is kind of what it looks like. Look at this hose clamp versus this hose clamp. Okay, this hose clamp on the right is the correct style of hose clamp for Mercedes. This on the left is what we call a Yankee clamp. You can see rubber through it here, and it doesn't have the ridges around the edges here. And most of these Mercedes hose clamps will have a three-pointed star on them too, which is really pretty neat. Okay, and going over to the next. This is a Conti belt, which is probably a correct one for a Mercedes. Note the correct hose clamp. Note the paint mark here. You know, a lot of the times you'll see a white paint mark on coolant lines or in some other places. And they often came from the factory with paint marks on them to show that someone had inspected them and they were satisfactory. When I see that on a car, I replicate the paint mark. Note this is not a Mercedes radiator cap. It looks like something on my tractor. And note the rust here on the manifold, the rust on the hose clamp, and the rust on this hose clamp here. Okay, let's go through there. Oh. And more Yankee clamps in on this one. Here. Now, when you see a line, you know, like a line like that, Mercedes doesn't do its wiring harnesses this way. And so that should kind of jump out at you. Plus the ignition control board here, this is a crane ignition, aftermarket ignition. A lot of people, when they put aftermarket ignitions in, they'll go to the extent of hiding the aftermarket ignition so you can't see it if they're concerned about Concours. And here's the battery example. We've got an aftermarket battery. It did not come with the die-hard in it. It's got a little K&N sticker over in the air filter here. This grommet's cracked right here. And there's some Yankee clamps in here too, like there. Okay. And this air cleaner's dented on this one. corrosion on the clamps, Yankee clamps up here. All right, so here we have, see this sealant in here? It did not come from the factory with sealant glopped over like that. Mercedes just don't look like that. And of course there's corrosion in here too. You know, this one, see the yellow cadmium plating on these injector lines? That's about what it should look like in a nice original hose. Okay, and look how shiny this cam cover is. It didn't come from the factory that shiny. And note this oil that's, you know, you'd expect the entrant would probably have wiped that up before you know, before showing, but it's not supposed to leak like that.
Gary, we have a question on clamps before we move on. Is it about Sam asked when is Norma or Gemini or is it Gemini or GEMI clamps original?
I wouldn't penalize a Norma clamp that was in the appropriate style. In fact, that's what I typically buy for my cars. I'm not sure if Pete wants to jump in on that one, but
That question comes up all the time. Norma clamps typically went out late 67, early 68, and then Gemini clamps came aboard after that. The Gemini clamps are different in that they have a Phillips head screw instead of a slotted screw. The design's a little different. The Gemini clamps, I can't remember when they went out, but I think early 123s, maybe all the way through, but they went out. And of course, we look for the best effort to replace all the clamps of the uniform. It's hard to do that because in some cases the Gemini clamps were combined with the other clamps that we see. So, but again, in no way do we look for Yankee clamps anywhere, and we look for the best effort to replace the clamps.
thank you, Pete. I appreciate that. Okay, ignition wires, you know, it really didn't come from the factory with blue wires. And note down here, I think this is a 129. See how the bolts are rusty here on the cooling fan? Okay, and let's go to talk about scoring a little bit. And let's see, this is an engine compartment of an 88 R107 for 560 SL. And the real reason I put this slide in is because I've got exactly the same car in the next slide with a lot of deficiencies, and this one doesn't have a lot in it. In fact, I might only take off for discolored coolant reservoir. If you look at engine compartment on your list, cooling system is 2 points, and so, you know, nothing more than a quarter point for that discolored reservoir, and they're almost all going to look like that unless they just change the reservoir. And about the only other thing I see on this one is if you look at the brake fluid, you know, brake fluid is transparent. It's an amber transparent fluid, and Mercedes tells you to change it every 2 years, and it should really never be black. And so I'd probably take off a quarter point for that under braking system, 2 points max. Other than that, this one's pretty good. Let's go to the next one. Okay, now, same year car. Now, what do we see here? Let's just kind of go down the scoring sheet. Cooling system, okay, the same discolored reservoir, so maybe a quarter point. Look at the sticker on the radiator. It says A to Z auto radiator, okay? That's not Mercedes original. And so, yeah, maybe a quarter point off for that. HVAC system, 2 points max. Now, you can't see that much of the HVAC system. There's a line over here, but look back here. There is a ball valve stuck back over in here. This is because somebody's heater control valve wouldn't shut off, and they wanted to not sweat up to death in the car, so they put this ball valve in. That's not authentic. It probably has Yankee clamps on it too. But so got to deduct for that. Maybe that's a 2 point area, and there's not that much in the engine compartment to take off for on that. So maybe that's a half point. And that's really why I selected this one, because, you know, every once in a while you'll see something like that. Probably not in a concours. Under engine, exhaust manifolds, and mounts, say a little bit of scratching on the left cam cover here, maybe a 1/4 point. Braking system, 2 points max. I'd again take off for dark, unchanged brake fluid, maybe a 1/4 point. But look at the brake booster. Notice that almost all the black paint is gone from the brake booster as well. That should be a generally shiny black. And so that's maybe another 1/4 point off. Underhood body finish, going down the score sheet. Rust down over in here. So, you know, maybe a 1/4 point there. Miscellaneous items not covered. Now, whoops, I didn't mean to flip that slide. The air cleaner isn't really covered on any of them, so I usually put that under miscellaneous items not covered. And the finish on this air cleaner doesn't look right. The air cleaner ought to look like that instead of that. Also, there's a wing nut missing, and there's part of the intake missing over here. And so that's probably, you know, 1/4 for the missing air intake line and a 1/4 for, you know, the finish perhaps. Hose clamps. There's hoses and clamps, 2 points max. Note the washer line's discolored up here, but it's okay down here. So, you know, maybe a 1/4. Rusty clamps down here. See how rusty these two are? You know, so maybe a 1/4. Dirt, corrosion, leaks, 2 points max. This isn't paint over here. This is dirt on the power steering pump. And it's supposed to look like that, and it looks like that. So that's maybe a 1/4 point on that. And there's some corrosion over here on this line, so maybe a 1/4 point. And under, let's see, horns, wiper linkage, washer reservoir, you know, the washer reservoir cap is discolored, so, you know, maybe a 1/4 point on that. So I tried to get an engine compartment here that had a lot of stuff going on in it. And there's probably more than that. There's a little bit of staining on the AC, on the cruise control mechanism over here. But if you use the scoring sheet to methodically go through all the stuff, you know, you get through it and you'll be consistent as long as you're very cognizant of how much the max points off for any area are.
Quick question here from Reed. Would you take off for the partially gone CAD plating on the cruise control actuator?
Yeah, probably. Probably. I wasn't sure whether that was a stain or partially gone CAD plating. You know, the weakness of this being a picture is in reality you know kind of scan over and look closer and see what was really going on. He's talking about it over in here. Okay. All right, let's go to the next picture. And this is a 1957 190 SL. And it's actually, this is quite good, other than maybe there's some staining on top of the air filter, and I probably wouldn't take off for this battery. But the reason I slid this slide in here is you walk around to the other side of the car, and then you see this. Look carefully. Anything stand out here? Read the carburetor. It says Mikuni, and then you read under here, it says made in Japan. Now, I mean, this is a little subtle, but especially if you're not familiar with the cars, but if you look closely at it, you read made in Japan, it probably didn't come on the car. And these are Mikuni carburetors that have been backfit for the Solexes. Turns out a set of Solexes for this car is between $6,000 and $8,000. And so some people go and use the Mikunis instead. How much do you take off for this? All right, let's look on their score sheet. Fuel delivery carbs, injection system, intake manifold is a maximum of 2 points. Okay, that's split between authenticity and condition. There's some fuel staining on it, but the issue here is non-original carburetors, but you know, the manifold, the linkage, the hoses, the clamps are probably original. So, you know, maybe a ½ point for the Mikuni carburetors and maybe a ¼ point for the fuel stains, something like that. So this is not something I expect to see on one of these cars, but it's kind of an interesting learning point. I stumbled across that on a Bring a trailer.
Yeah. We've got the question about the battery. You mentioned about the battery on the prior slide. You said that you would not take off for the battery.
Well, it doesn't say Walmart, AutoZone, you know, and back in these days, Mercedes didn't have Mercedes branded batteries. The batteries on this car were, okay, there were a couple of different brands, and there were things that you basically almost hadn't heard of other than probably Bosch as well. This is, I think, a Champion battery. And if I just glance across this kind of looks period to me, even though, you know, the 190 SL correct battery that it was delivered with was a tar top battery with exposed conductors on it. And actually, you can buy reproduction versions of that battery, and that would be absolutely perfect. But we allow an OEM battery, and you know, I'd have a hard time justifying why that one isn't an OEM battery. You know, maybe it isn't. You know, maybe I take off for it, but you know, it doesn't exactly leap out at me that it's an AutoZone, O'Reilly, diehard like I showed you in the other example. Plus, the hold down's correct. You know, I wouldn't be focusing on it. It kind of looks period correct to me. Those of you that know this better than me can probably comment on that too. Anyway, let me go on. Getting a little behind where I wanted to be. All right, so this is my next to the last slide in this section, and then we'll take a break and have the quiz. All right, this is a 73 450 SL, and I specifically took this because there's a lot of issues with this one. Okay, so let's just go through the score sheet for engine compartment. Okay, on HVAC system, these cars, the air conditioning hose is red. Notice that this one has what looks like black overspray on it. And so, you know, it's discolored, and take off probably a quarter for that. Fuel delivery carbs injection system intake manifold, that's a 2-point area. And there's corrosion on the fuel lines in here. There's corrosion on the fuel line clamps. You know, maybe, you know, 2 deductions of a quarter for those areas. Wires, harness, relays, fuses. It's a 2-point area. Now, you probably can't read it, but these spark plug wires say import direct on them. Okay, clearly not a Mercedes wire, maybe a quarter for that. If you look carefully, cold start valve here, there's supposed to be a boot over this cold start valve. So, you know, maybe a quarter point for that. The temperature sensor over here has a crimp connector on it. That's not part of the original wiring harness, so maybe a quarter point for that. There's butt splices over here on the wires that go to the distributor trigger points. So, you know, maybe a quarter point on that. Be careful because we're starting to get up to too high a total deductions for that area. Braking system, 2 points. Brake, there's a discolored brake booster line back in here. So that's maybe a quarter. Firewall underhood grommets, a 2-point area. The insulation's coming off the firewall in here, so maybe a quarter point. Rust on the air filter, and I would put that under miscellaneous items not covered. It's also missing the center wing nut, so I might take off a half for that. Hoses and clamps, there's a Yankee clamp down here on the coolant hose here, so maybe a quarter there. Dirt, corrosion, leaks. There's rust on the engine lifting bracket here, and there's rust on the mounting bracket for the connector for the ignition trigger points. So maybe a quarter, and oh, by the way, it's dirty. So, you know, maybe a quarter or a half there. Note this paint mark here. That's an original paint mark, and you'll often see that on these cars. That is correct for the car. Sometimes there's also a paint mark on the front of the pulley for this. And so, you know, original paint marks are good. And when I see them on my cars, I replicate them with the right color paint to continue that tradition. Okay, this is the last slide, and here we'll take a break, then have the quiz. And the points that I want to emphasize. And if you get the impression that being consistent is important, okay, that's what I was trying to tell you on this slide. It's important to be consistent in your judging, both to make sure that you get a good, accurate ranking of the cars for the awards ceremony, but also so that the entrant will feel like that he's been fairly judged. The other major point is that, in general, the points are split between accuracy and condition, and you always have to go through that mental gym of deducting the points in proportion to the maximum points for that area, and make sure you don't overdo it, with the minimum deduction being a quarter of a point. You know, let me reemphasize, be consistent, and also we really want the entrants to want to come back, to feel like that they're fairly judged, to feel like they were respected. We'll always be pleasant to the entrants. We'll try to make it a learning experience for them as well as for us. But, treat them with respect and thank them for bringing their cars, because without entrants, we don't have concours. So make sure they enjoy it. And above all, be consistent in your judging. And so this is a good time for a break and also for some questions before we go to the quiz.
Okay, yeah, Pete's got his hand up here.
Okay.
Yeah, let me, can you hear me?
Yep.
Now, yeah, you're unmuted now, Pete. We can hear you.
I just happened to notice there a question from David Newton. Why would you not take off for the battery? Well, I would take off for the battery because it's obviously the correct battery for that car. I would look for a car with exposed battery filler caps on the top and probably some kind of a decal or something on it. There are batteries that are being made now for 190 SLs. Pretty expensive, but if you shop around, you may be able to find a battery that's correct size, has those options on it, and looks correct. That battery.
I appreciate the calibration. Thank you.
Gary, did we cover for the scribes about noting the reason for the deductions?
Yeah, I did mention that, but I'll go over that again. It's important to annotate the scoring sheet. You say -1/4, and then you say what it's for. That way, we can tell what we're taking points off for, and the entrant can see what's been deducted. So it gives them more of an impression of fairness in the scoring. I think I did mention that, but I'm glad to say it again.
Yeah, I've seen many people take their score sheets after the concourse, and they run them off to their mechanic, be it them or if they pay somebody else, and say, here, go fix all these things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I've got every score sheet I've ever had. So.